Wants to now.
Recording this way, so everybody in the room, you are safe. No worries, it's not gonna spin around and look at you. Everyone's free to sneeze. It's only recording Bob and his screen and his books. So Bob will be moving around, I assume.
Well, we'll see how tight I get here, but, yeah. If anyone's sleeping though, I'm gonna hit him with my laser pointer.
Oh.
So, that's right, so forewarned now, right?
No.
Yeah, because this laser pointer is strong, so that'll wake you right up if you're dozing.
Alrighty, we are at just 1 minute late of opening on a clock talk, so not too bad. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Wolf. I'm the programming coordinator for the Osterville Village Library. Thank you so much for joining us today. And to our friends joining us on Zoom, thank you for being here as well. Today, we are honored to have horologist Bob Frishman and his lovely wife, Jean, here with us today, giving us a history of timekeeping. Bob Frishman founded Bell Time Clocks in 1992. He has repaired over 8,000 mechanical clocks and has sold 1,800 vintage timepieces. He writes and lectures about the history, culture, and technology of horology, or the science of timekeeping. He has published 150 related articles and reviews, and he has lectured to more than 100 public audiences. His comprehensive biography of 18th century Philadelphia clockmaker Edward Duffield, the first ever written, was published in 2024 by the American Philosophical Society Press. He is a liveryman. Did I say that right?
Yes.
Ooh. He is a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers in London, a Silver Star Fellow of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, and co-chair of its annual New England Regional Meeting, and an active member of the Antiquarian Horological Society, also in London, a life member of the Willard House and Clock Museum, proprietor number 28 of the Boston Athenaeum, shareholder number 8 of the Library Company of Philadelphia, and a member of the American Antiquarian Society, the Grolier Club, and the Ross Society of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. That was a mouthful. Without further ado, Bob Frishman.
Thank you. Whenever people, read off all those things, somebody said, what if all those places meet on the same day? What do you do? But luckily it hasn't happened yet. But I sort of, every time I hear that list too, I say, I want to be that guy. How does that Bob Frishman guy get to do all that? And then I kind of realized that's me. And somehow, after 73 years on this planet, I guess you keep sticking your head out of the foxhole, and occasionally you do fun things. So that's what we're doing here today. So again, thanks for inviting me. This is fun. Again, I apologize to the Zoom audience in advance. Because you're not seeing my pictures as great as you would want to at home, but any that really appeal to you, Amy can tell you how to find me, and I'm happy to email you any of these pictures that you think will be exciting. Of course, on my cover, I have my cover slide. There's the a dial of an Edward Duffield clock, and I have copies of my book here that you're welcome to take a look at and borrow after I donate my book to the library here as well. Of course, this was a perfect time. Amy and I thought that we should get together on the day before everybody goes crazy with their clocks. When I was doing active clock repair, moving the hands ahead wasn't too much trouble for people. But in October, when they had to set the hands back, like I knew the next day I was going to get a lot of phone calls about how Uncle Ernie broke the clock, by setting it backwards. So that was fun. But daylight savings time, as you know, has been controversial. It first arrived here at the end of World War I, when they were thinking they would save energy. They really enacted it. Congress is usually very speedy, but in this case, they waited until the war was over, passed it, and then the farmers all squawked and they repealed it very promptly and brought it back again a couple of times until we got here now. But even in today's Wall Street Journal, which I looked at before I left, this front page, it still keeps coming up about people arguing about it, whether it saves energy, whether, the poor school kids are, miserable for the first month after the time change. And also, it's something that hasn't gone away. And as you see, it was a problem even in the old days. So, but this points out that actually, I guess they didn't worry about hours too much way back here, but clearly this is Stonehenge. I had to point out that just last November, I had a great tour of Stonehenge. There's Jean and I at that rock pile that, as we know, on the solstice times, the sun would shine through and tell those people from thousands of years ago that it was a special day after they'd gone to all the trouble of lugging those stones a long way and setting them up in that pattern. So I was also interested to come here to Osterville because my parents, as you see, the Daniel Frishman Gallery, if you've gone along Main Street and seen Gallery Place and the house there, my parents had an art gallery in there in the 1970s. They had a house in Centerville and we went by and that house is still there. It's not an art gallery anymore, but it was sort of great to see that again. In the house next door, there's my dad, by the way, and some artwork behind him. He's passed away, but that was, my parents loved art. That wasn't their profession, but they collected art, and then, like most collectors, they had too much of it, and they said, well, maybe we should open a gallery and sell stuff, and they did that for some years. So that was my dad. But in the house next door was where the Cahoons lived before they moved to Cotuit. So that was kind of fun to see. As you know now, their museum is there, and the Cahoon Museum is in Cotuit. But the thing that I still bought, I would already gone off to college by the time my parents had that gallery. But they, in the Cahoon house, there were some nice kitchen cabinet doors that Martha Cahoon had painted. So they said, oh, these are nice, let's sell them. So they sold them, I think, to a collector of Cahoon stuff. But they didn't poke around in the cellar long enough because I got this newspaper article a few years later. We're in the house that my dad used to own, but then they sold. Way back in the corner of the cellar, they found a Revolutionary War cannon, which, was probably worth more than the house, But I guess, my dad didn't crawl around in that cellar too much, so I'm still kind of mad about that, I didn't think to go down there or that we didn't find that cannon before the next owners did. But anyway, I guess that's part of life. So I'm glad you mentioned that I'm a liveryman. It's the guild that was chartered in 1631 by King Charles, because the clockmakers eventually said we need our own guild before they were with the goldsmiths and the locksmiths. So you start out as a freeman, meaning you're free of the city. You can do clock repair in the city. And then if you stay, they like you and you keep going, then you're a liveryman, where you actually don the livery, which is the robes, to become sort of a more elevated member of the worshipful company of clockmakers. And here I am receiving, becoming a liveryman, and that's the master. The master changes every year of this London Guild. So Jean and I get to go to these, livery dinners and all, sit there in black tie and wonder what the heck am I doing here? But it's a nice feeling to be in these guild halls, with pictures of the monarchs all around. When I became a freeman, I had to sign allegiance to the Queen. So I don't know if I'm going to get shipped off to Guantanamo, be a dual citizen. I don't know, but I just signed it. I figured, this is something I ought to do. So I did it. One of the benefits of being in the clockmakers company, in fact, any London guild, is that once a year you're allowed to drive sheep across London Bridge without paying a toll. So I haven't taken advantage of this yet, but actually it was a real perk a couple of hundred years ago. Because a lot of people were eating sheep in London, and the farmers would bring them in, but they had to pay a tax as they entered the city. So if you were in a guild once a year, you didn't have to pay that tax to bring meat, essentially, on 4 feet into the city. The other great advantage is that if you commit a capital crime in London, and you're a member of a guild, they hang you with a silk scarf instead of a hemp rope. Yeah, so my friend who's a liveryman, he jokes that his wife keeps a silk scarf in the glove box so that it's handy. And the final thing is that if you're drunk and disorderly within the city of London, You can't be arrested, they have to escort you home. So I haven't tried that either, but I'm hoping that it works for that one time when I've overindulged. But talking about timekeeping, which I guess is why I'm here. Of course, long ago, they didn't have mechanical clocks, and I'll talk about that. But sundials were the way that people told time, as long as it was daytime and it wasn't cloudy. The sundial was kind of the arbiter of what the real time was. And sundials go back, millennia. Supposedly they originated in Egypt, where the post would cast a shadow and people happened to notice that the shadow moved around during the day. This is a mosaic from Roman times. And this actually says up there, I'm late for lunch. And that's no lie. The sundial is sitting up on top, and they already were angry about the fact that these sundials, like clocks, they were ruling their lives. You can't eat when you're hungry, you can't go to sleep when you're tired, you have to wait for that sundial or water clock, anything like that, to tell you that it's okay to do something according to a schedule. So this is, of course, the story of Captain John Smith and Pocahontas, which they always leave out, was that at first Pocahontas wasn't there, and the chief was about to start banging John Smith on the head, but John Smith pulled out his little pocket sundial and showed it to the Native Americans who were about to kill him. And they were very intrigued by that, and they looked at it, and he started to explain how it worked. And then Pocahontas showed up and saved him. So now you know the real story of why Pocahontas saved Captain John Smith. This is Williams, who founded the colony of Rhode Island after the Boston Puritans booted him out because they didn't think he was observing properly. So here he is arriving in Rhode Island. I don't think this is a photograph. This is a rendering of his arrival, and this is his pocket sundial. So we know at that time people carried these around, and they liked to know what time it was. They recorded historical things, what they were doing based on time, and they also used it for, coordinating their movements. I'm gonna meet you at noon, so if the other guy had a sundial too, they could coordinate all that too. But another fun fact too, is that most of the houses first built in early New England faced south. And they did that partly so that the sun would shine into the front rooms and warm them, but the house itself could be a sundial. And they would have what's called a noon mark on a doorstep or a window. So when the sun was at noon, it would hit that mark, and these people had kind of a rudimentary sense of it being noontime in their houses. So here's a lovely old period house, New England period house, and it faces south. And most likely, almost certainly, they had a noon mark somewhere on that long before they had clocks or perhaps even sundials to work that. So this is not me. This is Ben Franklin, as you probably recognize. And the reason I'm showing him is because he designed the first American currency. As you see, it's dated 1776. This is called the Fugio dollar. You see, Fugio is Latin for time flies, essentially. And he's using a sundial motif here to tell us to mind your business. This isn't mind your own business. This is get busy, do your business, do your work. We have a company to build. We have the British to beat in our War of Revolution. So he thought that was a perfect symbol to put on the first American currency. And it even ended up on later currency too. Again, this is 1776. So when they were starting to print paper currency, because they were trying to fund the country in the meantime, there again is that same motif of a sundial being illuminated by the sun, and Franklin telling us to get to work because there's a lot to do here. So this is the chapter in my book that you'll be able to see about Edward Duffield and Ben Franklin, because they were lifelong friends, and that's part of the appeal of Edward Duffield, the Philadelphia clockmaker from that time, is that he and Franklin was older, but he knew Edward Duffield from birth because the Duffields lived right next door to where he lived, and there were lifelong communications between them as well. This is again the cover of my book showing Edward Duffield, published by the American Philosophical Press. The APS, American Philosophical Society, was founded by Ben Franklin in 1743. You see Franklin there in a statue. This is in Old Philadelphia, one of the historic buildings in Old Philadelphia. And within my book, I show several examples, about 70 examples of Edward Duffield clocks and other instruments that he made. And they are among the finest clocks made in America during the 18th century. This one, as you see, is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, and this one is at Colonial Williamsburg. I'll be speaking there in a couple of months at Williamsburg, particularly because they have a beautiful Duffield clock on display there. And this is one that I own. I own a Edward Duffield clock. Fortunately, I was able to find one that fit in my house. Mostly they're taller than 8 feet, but somehow this one just makes it under my ceiling in one of our house rooms. But as my wife Jean will point out, the important part of this picture is her bay laurel tree that's standing there, and the clock really has no significance. It's this plant that's the important thing in this photograph. But I like them both, right? And we have plenty of bay leaves for our spaghetti sauce when the time comes to cook them. So again, another chapter of my book is really about the history of horology, of timekeeping, and this is in Philadelphia, but I'll be talking about it more generally and again more specifically about New England. This is my boat, or no, I guess this is the Mayflower, and the reason I show this is that you raised the question of how many clocks and watches were on the Mayflower. And the answer is 0, because most people didn't have them. They weren't reliable. They were expensive. And the people that came on the Mayflower were not ones who were going to bring clocks or watches with them. This is an illustration of the Mayflower leaving the Netherlands when they were packing up to come across the ocean. And you see nobody is carrying a grandfather clock over their shoulder. They were telling time in different ways on seaboard. You may also know that the Mayflower's first stop was in Provincetown Harbor. They didn't get to Plymouth until later. So this is a view. Gene and I love to stay in Provincetown at the Land's End Inn. Some of you may know that place. We have a little deck here that we look out over the harbor. But if we'd been on this deck, in 1620, we would have seen the Mayflower out there for some weeks before they moved on. And the reason they stopped as soon as they found land is that the Mayflower ran out of beer. And it wasn't because they were partying and wanted to drink. That was the drink. It had alcohol in it, so it was killing the germs. The water on ships was horrible, but they ran out of beer. And one of the first things they did was, go find some corn that the Native Americans had hidden and started to brew beer. It was a woman's job usually to brew the beer so that they had a beverage that they could drink. So you may have seen this plaque up there in P-Town too, so if you don't believe what I just told you, it's now written here that the Pilgrims were here first in Provincetown before they moved on to Plymouth. So basically the problem was there wasn't enough water there, the soil didn't look good enough, so they needed to find a better place to try to establish their place. So once they were on shipboard, there was a system of bells. If any of you have a Chelsea clock that strikes ship's bells, you'll know that that's the system on board, where every 4 hours, the watches are divided into half hours, and each half-hour watch was how long the guy steering the ship would have to serve before he was replaced at every half hour. So it starts from 1 to 8, and you probably heard 8 bells, 6 bells. That's the way that you determine. And this is a Winslow Homer painting, by the way, if you haven't noticed that already. And they also had sand glasses, so you can't tell what time it is from a sand glass, but you know the duration of time. So on shipboards, these were half-hour sand glasses that they would turn over. And if a guy was out there steering the boat in the sleet in the middle of the night, he might be tempted to turn that sand glass over a little bit before the sand had run all the way out so he could go back to bed. And if they did that long enough, if it was foggy or cloudy, you could actually reverse night and day on board the ship. Timekeeping from these people doing something called eating sand, where they turn the sand glass over a little bit too fast. The other thing that sand glasses were used a lot for was in churches to time the sermon. So you see here's, this is a great Hogarth painting from the 18th century, showing everybody asleep essentially while this minister is going on. But he's got a sand glass there, and supposedly, he would be timed and the sermon was supposed to end. But if he was powerfully moved by the Spirit of God, he could say, I'm going to take another glass, and he'd turn the sand glass over to start again, and everybody would moan, I guess, and be sorry that he did that. But that was a place, and most early churches would have sand glasses to time that. This is a sand glass that was actually used in a church, the oldest still remaining church. It's called the Old Ship Church, and they own this sand glass. And this is a place where again, these sermons were being timed. This is Samuel Sewell, who you may recognize was one of the judges in the witch trials in Salem. And as a younger man, he wasn't ever a minister, but he had to step into to do some lecturing or maybe preaching in a church when he was young. And in his diary, he explained how he was so nervous when he was called up to the pulpit that he didn't dare look at the sand glass as he was talking and talking. And then at the end, he realized he'd spoken for 2.5 hours. So that's so mortifying to him that he had gone on and on without saying that. Samuel Sewell is the one who he participated in the witch trials, and then some years later said, I made a horrible mistake, and he sort of stood up in church and confessed that that was a very bad thing that he had done. Not a lot of the other judges did that, but Samuel Sewell did, and he's much admired for confessing essentially that he'd made a horrible mistake. During that, there's a view of one of the famous paintings of the Salem witch trials, you know, with the hysterical teenage girls. And of course, the only reason I like this painting is because there's a clock in it. So, they were kind enough to, the artist was kind enough to put a clock there in the scene. But of course, you know, timekeeping went way back, and it really originated for specific reasons in early monasteries in northern Italy, southern Germany, because there were starting to be monastic orders that wanted to pray at very specific times, day and night. So during the night, some maybe monk was sitting there watching a sand glass or watching a candle burn down that had lines on it. So they really needed some other way of keeping track of those hours so they could wake up every few hours and go pray, which they felt was very important. So they would, if someone was watching the sand glass of the candle, then they would ring the bell, but eventually the mechanical clock was invented. And the word clock is based on a Latin term for bell. So the early clocks didn't have hands, they just would ring the bells at specific times. Now, according to some artists, clocks originated much earlier. This is Botticelli, a fresco by Botticelli that's in Florence. This is Saint Jerome, who lived about 300 AD, but Botticelli decided to put a clock in there, and there weren't clocks like this for another 1100 years. But Botticelli wanted a clock in this image because in this image, this is Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine is thinking about Saint Jerome, because we know from these things that he's contemplating Saint Jerome's life, and this is the time roughly that Saint Jerome supposedly died. So Botticelli wanted to put in this image the time of something related to Saint Jerome with Saint Augustine here, contemplating that. And some of the folks that came early, and I have a few more, I just finished an exhibit at Gordon College about the connections between timekeeping and religion. And I've already told you about one of those, which is, you know, how the monasteries had these timekeeping devices to pray at the times they wanted. So we had over 80 artworks and clocks all related to the connections between horology and religion. And this was kind of our signature image, was the one of St. Augustine with the clock. This is a view of the gallery that shows some of the clocks and artworks that we showed. Some of the clocks from my collection, including my Duffield clock, was moved to the gallery. This is an old tower clock. I'll talk about it a little later. It's the movement that was inside of the steeple. And some early big steeple clock hands as well. This is one of my other favorites from the exhibit. These both, this and others are miniatures that were in books of hours that people read in order to know when to pray. But this shows King Solomon repairing a clock. So you see there's tools down there. He's got some parts already. So obviously King Solomon lived about 1,000 years before, 2,000 before there were clocks. But in this case, you know, the clocks were understood to be kind of metaphors for God. That God, the clockmaker, was a common metaphor at that time, that God created the universe the same way that a clockmaker creates a clock. So the clockmaker finishes the clock, puts the last gear in, winds it up, and starts it ticking the same way that God, you know, put the universe together and started it off, and then it was going. So anybody looking at this would understand that that's what the metaphor and symbolism was. And these images here, those were the people who actually paid for this book of hours in this illustration. So as you may know, in some Renaissance paintings, that if somebody commissioned an artwork, they got into the picture. So this was, again, the people who paid for this are shown here being devotional. So the first tower clock movements, the words and steeples, this is Salisbury Cathedral in England. And the oldest known clock movement from the tower clock movement is on display there. We don't know of any that are older than this. It's from the 1300s. So I just, again, was there last November, and we were visiting Jonathan Betts, who's one of the most famous horologists really in the world, and he's a friend of mine, and put us up. And this was his friend who gave us a tour of Stonehenge and other places too. And we're looking inside the cathedral. They don't have it operating the big clock anymore, but they do have it connected, and it can tick and ring the bell. And he's pointing out something here. Jonathan Betts was the conservator at the Greenwich Observatory for decades. He produced several books, including this big, beautiful book about marine chronometers, which are marine ship timepieces at that time. He was replaced recently when he retired by this woman, Emily Ackermans, who's now the conservator and curator at the Greenwich Observatory. So you see her standing before the entrance there. So she's again also a very highly skilled clockmaker that works there now. And there's Jean and Jonathan Betts. He has a 1951 Bentley that he drove us around in. So we felt quite regal as Jonathan was driving us around here. We were visiting a famous old house, Stourhead, where Jonathan maintained some of the clocks in there after we'd pulled up in front in his nice old Bentley. So, of course, one of the most famous tower clocks is the one at Westminster. This is a photograph from the day in 1851 when the clock first struck, when the construction had finished and they built it. We all call it Big Ben, but that's not the name of it. Big Ben is the bell that's inside, and they named that after, one of the large men of the time. The clock is really the clock at Westminster. The tower is the tower at Westminster. That isn't Big Ben, but everybody has ended up calling it that, even though it's the bell's name, not the tower. I, of course, was looking in Osterville to see if you have any churches with clocks in them. Sadly, I could not find one, so I guess the cheapskates here in Osterville never wanted to pay for a clock to put in the tower. I did find this nice, this nice old picture though that shows the church there, with the old Gulf station. So again, I looked, I couldn't find anything there. There's even an older picture again showing the church with the street clock that's there. I don't know if anybody's got a car newer than that in Osterville, but that's one that's parked there at the time, and we even know what time they took the picture, right? So, but again, no clock in that tower, nor even in your old schoolhouse. So I found that old picture too, and they could have had a clock right up there or something, but again, nobody wanted to pay for it down here, I guess. So, I have to say that in Andover, we have a clock in our tower, but apparently something went very wrong here. So I don't know if they might have planned to have a clock there, but luckily they didn't, because obviously some big wind came and blew that tower right into the top of the church. So were you there that day when that happened?
No, a bit before my time.
Okay, yeah, you didn't see the tower poke through the roof? Yeah, this is, I came across a collection of old lantern slides that were used for this kind of show 100 years ago. And this was one of the pictures in it, so that was exciting. So this tower does have a clock in it. This is in Newburyport, and this is a famous old church in Newburyport. This is the Howard Company clock movement that's in there now. I was up in the tower and got to take a look at it. So that's what's ticking up in the tavern now, up in the tower now. But this is what used to be there, because a friend of mine in his garage had this movement from the 1700s. That's the actual clock movement that was in that tower. And I've used it in my book as an illustration of the kinds of tower clock movements that would have been made at that time. We convinced him now to loan it to a museum up there in Newburyport so that that somebody can see it besides the mice in his garage. So we made some progress with that. The other amazing thing about that is that church and that clock is where George Whitefield preached. He was a huge voice in American evangelical. He was English, but he came to America many times. Ben Franklin heard him speak, and Ben Franklin even was kind of trying to compute how far away you could hear Whitefield, because he used to speak in open grounds to 10,000 people. And Franklin actually realized that like a quarter of a mile away, you could still hear him preaching. But the reason I mention him too, he preached in that church, but he's also sleeping there still. He died when he was in Newburyport, and George Whitfield, even though he was, English, he was here and he died and he's buried in that church. So he was hearing that clock ticking and striking while he was alive preaching, but even after he was underground in that same church. The fun thing too about that is, like many churches in New England, the bell was made by Paul Revere. Because Paul Revere, after, the things that we know about him that made him famous, he was in metalworking and bell casting in Canton, Mass. And many bells in New England still are Paul Revere bells. So we know him, of course, from his midnight ride. He was not screaming the British are coming because everybody was British. He was saying the regulars are coming, and everybody understood that those were the British soldiers. So here he is racing around, and Paul Revere produced this propaganda piece right after the Boston Massacre, when British soldiers fired on peaceful protesters who were throwing rocks and